Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and we are all familiar with the southern Italian city of Pompeii and its nefarious fate. Whether it be from a movie, a scholarly recreation, or a direct visit to the archaeological site, whenever we hear that word, the first thing we think is the volcanic event, the violent eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which resulted in the utter destruction of the city and the annihilation of its people. But what is the story of Pompeii? How did the event actually happen? And are there really preserved bodies? And are they real? And besides, why did the original settlers decide to build their city right next to a volcano in the first place? Alright then, but let's begin by, well, what we know. How did it all start? Like many cities of the classical world, Pompeii also had its founding myth. According to Servius, the city was supposedly founded by none other than the demigod Hercules, and its name would have originated from the following sentence, meaning from the triumph of Hercules. However, the most recent archaeological discoveries confirm a foundation dating back to around the 8th century BC by the Oscan people, an Italic tribe corroborating what Strabo reported in his Geography. The Oscans were part of a large linguistic family of Umbro-Sabellian or Osco-Umbrian peoples, distinct from the Latins who probably arrived in Italy in the 12th century BC. The archaic Oscan word Pompeii, which is analogous to Greek penta and Latin quinque, means 5. This is most likely a reference to the proto-urban reality formed by the progressive fusion of 5 pre-existing villages or inhabited centers. 5 small Oscan towns that were scattered around the slopes of the Vesuvius near the River Sarno. But why would they build near a volcano of all places, considering, how dangerous it is and how things actually ended up? The ancient inhabitants of Pompeii, like many other civilizations throughout history, chose to settle near volcanoes for several compelling reasons, despite the potential dangers. Here is an explanation of why they made these choices. Fertile soil. Volcanic soil is extremely rich in minerals and nutrients, making the land around volcanoes ideal for agriculture. This fertility supported larger populations and more diverse crops. Natural resources. Volcanic areas often provide access to valuable resources like obsidian, sulfur, and various minerals used in ancient crafts and trade. Lack of geological understanding. Sometimes ancient people didn't fully understand the mechanism of volcanic eruptions and their potential for catastrophic destruction. Moreover, the last major eruption of Vesuvius before 79 AD was likely prehistoric, so there was no living memory of its danger. Infrequent eruptions. Many volcanoes, including Vesuvius, can remain dormant for long periods. This can create a false sense of security among nearby populations. Strategic location. Pompeii was located in a prime spot for trade, with access to the sea and inland routes. The benefits of this location may therefore have outweighed perceived risks. Religious and cultural significance. Volcanoes were often seen as sacred in ancient cultures, associated with deities or supernatural forces. This could make living near them culturally desirable. Limited mobility. Ancient societies were less mobile than modern ones. Once established, it was difficult to relocate entire cities. Not impossible, but even if dangers became apparent, this may not have been desirable. Economic investment. As cities grew and prospered, the economic and social costs of abandoning them became increasingly high. Adaptation and mitigation. Over time, societies living near volcanoes often developed strategies to cope with minor volcanic activities, such as small earthquakes or ashfalls. Lack of alternatives. In some regions, volcanic areas might have been among the best available locations for settlement, despite the risks. It may be also worth to note that while the destruction of Pompeii was catastrophic, the city had been thriving for centuries before the eruption of 79 AD. In other words, from the perspective of the ancient inhabitants, the benefits of the location may have outweighed the risks of a potential eruption that may have not happened in their lifetimes. This balance of risk and reward in choosing settlement location is not unique to ancient times. Even today, many major cities are located in areas prone to natural disasters, demonstrating that humans often prioritize immediate benefits over long-term uncertain risks. Not to mention that the river Sarno was not only navigable at the time, but it constituted a major artery for commerce. And recent investigations have outlined the existence of a river port adjacent to the southern front of what would become the inhabited area of Pompeii between Porta Marina and Porta Stabiana, opening onto what must have been a lagoon formed by the course of the Sarno River. Alright, after all of this introduction, I would like to now jump into the meat and bones of this video. Let's talk a little bit about Tephrochronology. Now, Tephrochronology is the dating of volcanic eruptions or events, and it's usually done by studying the layers of ash called tephra. Although then again, when we talk about tephra, it's not just ash, but any material or particles that are ejected by a volcanic eruption. Now, even before the infamous eruption of Vesuvius that would cause Pompeii's annihilation, the city was devastated by a tremendous earthquake, of which we have a testimony in Seneca, who, in Book 6 of Naturale Questiones, writes, "I have learnt, excellent Lucius, that Pompeii, a populous city of Campania, meeting point of the coast of Sorrento and Stabia on one side and Herculaneum on the other, which separate the open sea with a pleasant gulf, has been shaken by an earthquake that has also affected the entire adjacent area. And this happened in the middle of winter, in a season that our ancestors claimed to be immune from dangers of this kind. In fact, a part of the city of Herculaneum collapsed, and even what remains standing has an uncertain stability. Even Naples, slightly touched by the great disaster, has suffered many losses in private property, but not in public property. Some villas have collapsed, a flock of 600 sheep was killed, statues were cracked, some people, crazed following the catastrophe and out of their minds, wander aimlessly through the fields." It is actually quite interesting the way Seneca discusses the earthquake. As you can see, it doesn't really attribute any mystical or divine retribution or supernatural origin to it, but just discusses it as an imponderable natural phenomenon presented with a certain fatalism. Now, there are other writers, such as Posidonius, that give us more insight on how the ancients perceived earthquakes and how modernly, really, they were trying to at least assess and understand the causes and causal links of such natural disasters. I might read a little bit of those towards the later end of this video, so watch until the end. But apart from Seneca's source, in Pompeii itself there is evidence of the earthquake. A bas-relief from the Pompeian house of Lucius Caecilius Iucundus clearly shows the representation of a collapsed building. After the earthquake, Pompeii will initially undergo a contraction, but the necessities of reconstruction and consequently the flourishing of new opportunities will bring in new manpower. It will be on a city still struggling to recover from the destructive power of an earthquake that Vesuvius will strike with its eruption in 79 AD, on an unknown date between the 24th of October and the 1st of November. Although a precise date has not yet been defined, today we can affirm that the eruption occurred after September 7th or 8th, and probably between the 24th of October and the 1st of November 79 AD. We know this because we have seen a silver denarius celebrating the 15th acclamation of Emperor Titus, which we know took place after the September 7th or 8th, and the discovery in Pompeii of an inscription bearing the date of the 17th of October. Another element that helps to temporarily place the event is the discovery, under the layers of ash caused by the eruption, of typically autumnal fruits, so fruits that are usually available during autumn, such as dried figs, walnuts, chestnuts, and pomegranates, vessels containing already sealed musts, and braziers already in use in houses for heating rooms. Previously was believed that the eruption occurred on the 24th of August, taking cue from the date present in a letter from Pliny the Younger who, writing to Tacitus, narrates the death of his uncle Pliny the Elder who died in the disaster, but given the evidence listed above, many lean towards a transcription error. On the other hand, Pliny the Younger's letter helps us reconstruct, with good approximation, the dynamics of the eruption. Pliny the Younger first writes that his uncle's curiosity was aroused by the fact that, while he was at Cape Misenum, a cloud was rising. It was difficult for those at a distance to identify from which mountain. It was later known to be Vesuvius, whose shape could be compared to a pine. He means a maritime pine, more than any other plant. Indeed, once projected high with a sort of very long trunk, it widened as if branching out. The cloud described by Pliny is of course the column of smoke following the volcanic eruption. The type of eruption, which in reference to the classical accounts is referred to as a Plinian eruption, is caused by a type of highly viscous lava and magma which, creating a plug, led to an accumulation that due to internal pressure ends up causing a real explosion. Characterized by high-speed exits from the volcanic conduit of a jet of gas mixed with pumice and ash, the Plinian eruption generates an eruptive column several kilometers high, which, expanding in the atmosphere, takes the shape indeed of a cloud. Subsequently, according to Pliny the Younger's account on Pliny the Elder's ship, who had decided to go from Cape Misenum towards Pompeii to provide aid to the population, ash was raining, which became hotter and denser as they advanced. Now even pumice and dark stones, carbonized and cracked by fire, were falling. This because with the reduction of density of the eruptive cloud, the eruptive materials, lapilli, pumice, and ash fall downwards, dispersing over an area whose width is directly proportional to the intensity of the explosion. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Pliny the Younger continues reporting how, once landed and gone to the center of Stabia, near Pompeii, his uncle noted that on several parts of Vesuvius, wide stripes of fire and high fires were shining, and the glow and light were increased by the darkness of the night. These that we see described are in fact the effects of a pyroclastic flow, the flow of material and hot air currents that, projected by the eruption, burns everything they encounter. The inhabitants of the centers closest to the volcano, like Herculaneum, had probably died killed by the thermal shock caused by the tremendous heat blast, while those of Pompeii and Stabia, who had not had the foresight to flee in time and who had waited for the fires to arrive, had died either as a result of collapses caused by telluric movements linked to the eruption, and especially due to asphyxiation because of the cloud of ash that had fallen on the settlement, as Pliny the Younger reports. He tells us the air, too impregnated with ash, must have prevented his breathing by obstructing his throat. Taphonomy is the scientific study of how organisms decay and become fossilized or preserved. It is a subdiscipline of paleontology and archaeology that examines the processes affecting organic remains from the time of death until their discovery as fossils or artifacts. The term derived from the Greek word taphos, burial, and nomos, laws. It encompasses biostratinommy, diagenesis, differential preservation, site formation processes, and taphonomic bias. Taphonomic studies are crucial for interpreting the fossil record and archaeological remains accurately, helping researchers distinguish between the effects of preservation and the original state of the organisms in question. Moreover, this field is interdisciplinary, drawing from biology, chemistry, geology, and archaeology to provide a comprehensive understanding of how remains transition from the biosphere to the lithosphere. Pumice, but especially ash, would have continued to fall incessantly on Pompeii and the neighboring towns for days, and the corpses of the inhabitants ended up incorporated by the volcanic dust, which subsequently solidified. Inside, the bodies decomposed and wasted away. So, under the layers of ash which remained, cavities formed, like a sort of negative, and by filling these cavities with plaster casts, archaeologists were capable to create the casts of the victims which we find. Now, this is really important to underline because I think people have this overall misunderstanding when they go and visit Pompeii as an archaeological site that what they are seeing are like mummified remains, but that's not what happened. The ash once again settled the inside, which contained the bodies wasted away and decomposed, but the cavity remained in its original shape, and that was filled with casts. So these are casts, but they are absolutely coherent with the last position and remains of the bodies, and sometimes they even contain little pieces of these bodies, like a tooth or a nail. Now, Suetonius tells us that the emperor, who at the time was Titus, actually did his best to come to the aid of the population. We read, "There were some dreadful disasters during his reign, such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Campania. He showed not merely the concern of an emperor, but even a father's surpassing love, now offering consolation in edicts, and now lending aid so far as his means allowed. He chose commissionaries by lot from among the ex-consuls for the relief of Campania, and property of those who lost their lives by Vesuvius and had no heirs left alive be applied to the rebuilding of the buried cities." But while the settlement of Stabia seemed to recover following the eruption, and that of Herculaneum is subsequently at least partially rebuilt, Pompeii, buried under an insurmountable blanket of ash, will not see new life again, and will have to wait for the excavations begun in the mid-18th century to return to the light of day. Therefore, the preserved bodies at Pompeii, often referred to as casts, were not intentionally created, but rather formed as a result of the unique circumstances of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Pyroclastic flow. The eruption produced a deadly pyroclastic flow, a fast-moving mixture of hot gases, ash, and volcanic debris. Rapid burial. Victims were quickly buried under layers of ash and pumice, which hardened around their bodies. Bodies decomposition. Over time, the soft tissues of the bodies decayed, leaving hollow spaces within the hardened ash. Discovery. When excavations began in the 18th and 19th centuries, archaeologists found these hollow spaces. Plaster casting technique. In 1863, Giuseppe Fiorelli, an Italian archaeologist, developed a method to preserve these body shapes. Liquid plaster was poured into the cavities. The plaster hardened, creating a cast of the the body's position at the moment of death. The surrounding ash was then carefully removed. Details preserved. This method captured remarkably detailed impressions of the victims, including facial expressions, clothing folds, and even hairstyles. Not mummies. It is important to note that these are not actual preserved bodies, but rather casts of the spaces left by the bodies. These casts provide a poignant and vivid connection to the past, offering unique insights into the human experience of this ancient disaster. They are not only valuable for archaeological study, but also serve as a powerful reminder of the destructive force of nature and the fragility of human life. Alright, let's step back a little bit now and let's talk again a little more how the ancients perceived this fertile soil that was around a volcano. There is a very interesting source that I would like to share with you now, and it comes from Strabo. Check this out. Above these places like Mount Vesuvius, which save for its summit have dwellings all around, on farmland that are absolutely beautiful. As for the summit, a considerable part of it is flat, but all of it is unfruitful and looks ash-colored, and it shows pore-like cavities in masses of rock that are soot-colored, and on the surface, these masses of rock looking as though they have been eaten out by fire, and hence one might infer that in earlier times this district was on fire, and had craters of fires, and then, because the fuel gave out, was quenched. Perhaps, too, this is the cause of the fruitfulness of the country all around the mountain, just as of Catania. It is said that parts of the country which had been covered with ash dust from the hot ashes carried up into the air by the fire of Aetna made the land suited to the vine, for it contains the substance that fattens both the soil, which is burnt out, and that which produces the fruits. So then, when it acquires plenty of fat, it was suited to burning out, as it is the case with all sulfur-like substances. And then, when it had been evaporated and quenched and reduced to ash dust, it passes into a state of fruitfulness. Now, I always find particularly fascinating the way ancient people were so methodic and so inquisitive in the way they were trying to analyze the data that they had access to. Now, of course, in this case, Strabo was actually wrong. The reality is that the enriching substance obviously was the organic matter accumulated in the ash dust during a long period of exposure to atmospheric agents. In any case, it is still evident that, considering the fact that he gave us a parallel with Catania in Sicily near the Etna, today we read volcano, it kind of gives us the idea that indeed the ancients did understand, even though they didn't know the exact organic reasons, but they did understand that the soil around volcanic areas was indeed fertile, and it was. This phase is placed in the 7th century BC, when the infiltration of Etruscan commercial elites led to the birth of what is commonly called Etruscan Campania, to distinguish it from Etruria proper, northern Lazio, Toscana, and parts of Umbria, and Padania and Etruria, northern Italy. The Etruscan penetration into Campania should not be imagined as a massive immigration, but rather as the infiltration of relatively few, but culturally and economically influential elements. The excavations carried out in this sanctuary of Fondo Iozzino, located just outside the city walls, offer a picture that shows a cultural preponderance of the Etruscan element starting from the 7th century BC. According to Massimo Osanna, archaeologist and director of the Archaeological Park of Pompeii, Fondo Iozzino is the site that has yielded the largest number of Etruscan inscriptions outside of Etruria proper. Several ex-votos which were found in the sanctuary bear the term Apa, meaning father in Etruscan, probably referring to the deity worshipped in the sanctuary, while Apa is a general epithet in Etruscan cult practices similarly associated with various deities such as Tinia, Jupiter, and Hercules. According to Osanna, the Apa worshipped in Pompeii should be linked to Apa Suri, literally the Black Father, a kind of infernal Apollo who was also honored in the Etruscan sanctuary of Pergi. Not coincidentally, the reconstructing of Pompeii's urban layout, which occurred in the 6th century BC, in addition to the erection of a tough wall, would see the foundation of a temple dedicated to Apollo in a prominent position. So the economic and commercial success of Pompeii is definitely triggered by the Etruscan, but it is also important to understand that the very center of the city was in fact extremely multi-ethnic, having for the majority a mixture of 3 different people: the Oscan, indigenous, the Etruscan, and the Greek. The Temple of Apollo, for example, erected between 550 and 530 BC, is an Etruscan-type building that nonetheless displays Campanian, so Oscan artistic elements, in clay on its roof, created in Cumaean Greek workshops. A focal point of identity both in terms of religiously and political institutions of archaic Pompeii, the temple is centrally located near what will become the Forum of Roman Pompeii. As already emphasized, the temple is Etruscan, a sign of an Etruscan community that held a prominent position in the urban reconstructing of the 6th century BC. The god is Apollo, a deity widely spread in Etruscan Campanian centers, but also a guarantor of contracts and integration with Greek element. Further evidence of Pompeii's multicultural reality is the Temple of Athena and Hercules, located in the Triangular Forum. A Doric temple, thus a Greek-style building, is situated on the edges of the monumental quarter. Built near the port, it should be framed as a sort of sacred entrance to the city, a safe place to welcome foreigners and merchants, establish in hospitable relationship with them. Not coincidentally, besides Athena, it is dedicated to Hercules, a traveling and civilizing hero. If initially the Greek element is thus to be framed predominantly among the merchants and foreigners who could arrive in Pompeii, subsequently these become part of the social fabric of the city, and the subsequent embellishment made to the Temple of Athena and Hercules are probably attributable to Magna Graecian craftsmen who were directly from the centers of Posidonia. The properly indigenous element, that is, the Oscan, in addition to being represented by the manufacture of some ceramics found alongside the more refined Etruscan types, is also attested by epigraphic evidence. An inscription in the Oscan language indicates the presence near the city of a temple dedicated to Jove Meilikios, Jupiter's sweet as honey, an aspect of Jupiter specific to the Oscan world. Strabo also writes that after Etruscan domination, the city had a phase of Samnite domination, but this occurs following a series of geopolitical upheavals affecting southern Italy and the Tyrrhenian Sea. In the 5th century BC, the Etruscan world, allied with the Carthaginian one, is increasingly on a collision course with the Greek world, in a struggle for control of the Mediterranean. The crescendo of tensions will lead in 474 BC to the Battle of Cumae, in which an Etruscan fleet will face a Syracusan fleet, thus Greek Siceliot, off the coast of Cumae, and the fortunes of the naval battle will favor the Greeks. The consequences of the Battle of Cumae are disastrous for all of Etruscan Campania. Its centers are downsized and progressively shift from management by Etruscan elites to control by Greek elites, and this also happens in Pompeii. Greek control will be relatively short-lived, and in the last quarter of the 5th century BC, Pompeii will be occupied by the Samnites, as Strabo also reports, thus bringing the center back into the orbit of the Oscan world, as it was at its foundation. The Samnites, a rough mountain people, descend from the lands that today correspond to Abruzzo and occupy more or less violently the rich cities of Magna Graecia, of the plain. From this moment on, until the 3rd century BC, Pompeii seems subordinate to another Campanian center that had benefited from the Etruscan contribution for its urban evolution, and which ended up being occupied by the Samnites, Nuceria Alfaterna, today's Nocera. Tied to the fortunes of Nuceria, Pompeii will be an adversary of Rome, together with the other Samnite communities during the First and Second Samnite Wars, to then enter the orbit of the Roman Republic, while subsequently, still as a subordinate of Nuceria, it will be one of a few Samnite centers to remain loyal to Rome during the Second Punic War, refusing to join Hannibal. Pompeii will instead rise against Rome at the outbreak of the Social War, along with hundreds of other Italic centers whose inhabitants loudly demand to obtain the same rights as Roman citizens, distancing itself with this gesture from the cumbersome influence of Nuceria, which instead will remain faithful to the Urbs. Besieged by Sulla, Pompeii surrenders in 89 BC, but does not seem to suffer excessively harsh treatment, and at the conclusion of the Social War, the Pompeians finally receive the coveted Roman citizenship, being enrolled within the voting district of the Menania tribe. The process of Romanization is not invasive, but from a cultural point of view, the Roman component will add to the pre-existing ones, as attested by the permanence of usage of the Oscan and Greek languages in Pompeian graffiti. In fact, the full entry into the Roman world will be enormously advantageous for Pompeii, and if during the Samnite period the city had been substantially a satellite of Nuceria, now it becomes a true gem of Campania. The relations between Pompeii and Nuceria, abruptly broken by the outbreak of the Social War, will always remain tense, so much so that Tacitus recalls a clash that occurred in 59 AD in the amphitheater of Pompeii between Pompeians and Nucerians, and inhabitants of Nuceria, which degenerated into a real urban guerrilla warfare, and it's portrayed in the fresco of a Pompeian house. And with this, I hope that I've given you an extensive and comprehensive analysis not only of what actually happened in Pompeii during the devastating event of 79 AD, but also its creation, its evolution, its different ethnicities, cultural and economic importance and weight that the city had before becoming the gem of Campania and before going out in one last terrifying moment. As always, noble ones, if you have any questions about this topic or any topic, or if you have any requests, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.